Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, DevOps.com. We're excited to have you join us. We have a great topic. It's redefining CLI to unify security and DevOps. Thanks for joining us. We have some great speakers today. My name is Mitch Ashley. I'm going to serve as your host and moderator. Just a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, and we will send an email with the link to the recording and the slides following the webinar. You'll also be able to get that on DevOps.com. Our speakers love questions, so please be sure to ask questions. Pop those into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar software, and we'll be catching a good amount of time at the end to be able to answer some of your questions. We do have a drawing for Amazon gift cards, so stick around to the end. We'll be picking 3 participants from today's webinar, excluding, of course, myself and our speakers. So we hope that we wish everybody luck and hope you enjoy that. So let's get to our topic, redefining CLI to unify security and DevOps. I have a great pleasure of introducing our 2 speakers for today. First is Kavya Pearlman, who is cybersecurity strategist with Wallarm, and also Abraham Milan, security solutions architect at Wallarm. So with that, I'm going to toss the baton to you, Kavya. So take it away.
Thank you, Mitch. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this wonderful session. I'm Kavya Pearlman. I'm the cybersecurity strategist here at Wallarm. Due to my work and contribution to the security industry, I've won several awards, and it is quite an honor to be called Cyber Guardian by the security community. I'm also the founder and CEO of XR Safety Initiative. It's a nonprofit dedicated to helping build safe, immersive environments via virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. My quest to find the best security solution to protect these brave new worlds is kind of what took me to Wallarm. Wallarm solutions plug right into the CI/CD pipeline, and then they utilize artificial intelligence and machine learning to help secure APIs, cloud-native environments, exactly what I recommend to a lot of companies to secure these modern infrastructure. And with me today is Abraham Milan, Abe, who is also working at Wallarm as the security solutions architect. He comes with 15 years of industry experience, and as a security advisor at Enhance, Cities, Synthetic, he's also co-founded a nonprofit for low-income families. Abe, welcome, and share with us about yourself and what about CLI, why CLI?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kavya. It's a pleasure to be here. Very excited to continue the conversations. As a security solutions architect on a daily, I've observed, from conversations that I've had with DevOps and security folks, there's a rift between those 2 universes, right? They speak very different languages, if you will. And, as part of my purview, supporting sales teams, marketing teams, and just having conversations with our counterparts on the other side of the phone, going into those conversations from a DevOps perspective or a security perspective, the expectations are very different. And the context of those conversations, the output is very different. I'm not surprised at that. And the rift comes where they're speaking different languages. They know exactly what the end goal is, but how do we bridge the gap and have security, get DevOps to cooperate in applying patches that are deeply needed and required by the industry, whether it's a compliance mandate or a mandate driven by an outside customer. How do we get everyone on the same page to achieve those goals? And that's why I'm here. I love advocating for all kinds of security, especially all things application security is concerned. It excites me. I like to geek out with all folks that are involved from left to right of the software development lifecycle. And definitely continuing conversations like this is very needed. It excites me. And thank you so much, Mitch and Kavya, for having me on board to continue this.
Wonderful. So for today's agenda, we'll go over various universes that organizational entities live in, and then what are the aspects that remain important to them? We'll also cover how security integrates with the CI/CD pipeline when it comes to application security. What exactly is CLI? This term that we're referring to try to bridge security with the development process. What exactly is that? We'll kind of dive into it. And just about, I think it was like 3 weeks ago, Abe told me this funny story, and I was like, you've got to tell this to our audience. So we'll hear this from Abe, this story that really talks about, this need for CLI. And then I'll share some findings from this report that came out in July. It's from GitLab. It sort of supports this whole conversation and discussion that we're about to have. And we'll finally conclude this with some key takeaways that we could ponder on, internalize, and sort of adopt as the industry. And finally, we'll take some questions. And yeah, so let's dive in. I talked about the universes that people live in. So personally for me, my background is security. Let's look at what security really cares about. So in my personal experience as a former CISO, I've led some security team members and spoken with various CISOs over CISO dinners, conferences, meetups, and whatnot. So what I found is that as a security team, the focus is generally, it's either driven by compliance mandate, or it is from the customer requirement, the contractual requirements, insurance requirements. So showing the proof of due diligence, and then, protecting sensitive customer data. So most of the teams that are involved are, of course, the CISOs, the Director of Information Security, the SOC team, the GRC team. These are the teams that are kind of talking these, sort of verbiage, the language, and they're more concerned about the requirements being compliance. Hey, what's the risk? How do we mitigate these risks? They also keep up with cyber attacks. So, this is the kind of the universe. And when it comes to tooling, it's all about, like, specifically, I'm talking about application security tooling. So pen testing, we've heard, you'll hear terms like DAST and WAF, things that are very, easy and natural to talk about when it comes to security universe, like bug bounty and a bunch of other application security tools. So this is the universe for, security folks. And I believe Abe has something to add to that when it comes to, risk sort of language.
Yeah, absolutely. And, having dozens of conversations on a week-by-week basis, involving, especially if companies come to us for a security solution and they come to us knowing that they're developing for the first time an application security program, where do they actually start? Now, if they have programs, applications in the runtime environment, programs in production that are outward facing and fully exposed, and if they're immature in such a way, if you will, in maturing these application security programs, they're usually what we call in a risk discovery mode, where they don't really have visibility into the risk. And CISOs or security leaders and team members, they're able to measure risk by enabling themselves to having visibility into their web assets, right? And they leverage tooling, and I believe Kavya mentioned it in our last slide, leveraging dynamic code analysis, WAF, to give you some understanding of what assets are exposed. And based upon that tooling, you're able to garner data that'll help drive decisioning across the security organization to set the policies that the DevOps, their counterparts on the other side of the fence, if you will, would enforce. Now, those decisions are only as good as the accuracy of the data is collected from the WAF, as well as the dynamic application security tooling, as well as pen tests. So that's important to drive a baseline as far as what exactly is your security posture. And by knowing that, security leaders are able to map out the risk to the organization, sensitivity of time to remediate, establish as well risk reduction measurements and mitigation controls. So once we find an area of potential exploitation, what do we go about? How do we go about plugging in with the virtual patch those areas of security flaw? and also determining how do we communicate this information, this data that security collected back to our friends in the DevOps office. And going back to that rift, it's oftentimes missed why developers are overlooking certain emails, if you will, on requests to apply these patches. So we do have a solution. We'll definitely get to it, and how we can achieve CLI to have everyone on the same page.
Wonderful. And another universe we need to talk about when we talk about DevSec and Ops is the DevOps universe, where most of the folks are, sort of a release engineer or the build engineer, and their considerations are quite different. They're more concerned about, hey, how can I automate things, move fast, if you will, and enforce these policies that are essential to the success of their, processes, their tooling. And when it comes to tooling, their tools are quite different. They're not talking specifically about security-specific tools. Instead, they're concerned about build pipelines. Circle CI, I'm actually wearing a t-shirt from Circle CI. So yeah, what are these tools? And these are teams that I have so closely worked with, and having had to invent these new languages sort of things. These are things that we must pay attention to. What kind of language are they speaking? They're talking about their matrix, like build time, release time, and continuous integration, continuous deployment. And I'm sure Abe has more to add to this when it comes to what is the risk related component that they are concerned about.
Absolutely, and just putting myself within the shoes also of a build engineer, this now we're talking about shifting left. So as you start to make those definitions for what your security posture is after a few cycles over the course of 6 to 12 months, now you want to start catching vulnerabilities earlier in the software development lifecycle. And that's where the release engineer comes into play, right? So they're already exposed to managing multiple pull requests, and they're also presented by other factions or BUs, if you will, with testing requirements to make sure that the application prior to deployment is behaving the way it's supposed to, as required by, maybe it's the customer that asked you, the developer, to make sure that this function does X, Y, and Z, and not A, B, and C. Now, understanding and making certain considerations, what they do is they want to validate the next release to lower the risk in production. They want to make sure that the developers are meeting the acceptance criteria, the baseline criteria that's required by all of the third-party factors. And unlike the security offices, or they set the policy, now the release engineer, they enforce those policies by administering the test to compare the deltas and the risk of the current or next release to the production branch. And in order for them to get that bit of visibility, they use tools like Circle CI, Jenkins, any sort of build pipeline to administer, for example, in the next slide, unit test or integration test. And now security is now layered onto those set of tests to make sure that it also meets those compliance mandates mandated by not just the security offices, but the industry, right? Whether it's PCI or HIPAA, so on and so forth. And here's a very basic example of a build pipeline. All of these tests would run concurrent of one another, ensuring that before passing the build, after they create the artifact, they'll do a test against it. Wallarm's approach is to look at the baseline functional test and traffic and fan out thousands of security tests against vulnerabilities listed in the OWASP top 10. Now, in the event that the build does fail, we push out a JIRA ticket or a Bugzilla ticket and communicate that back to the developer. And that's the basic workflow. We'll keep digging as we kind of define what that CLI really looks like.
Yeah, wonderful explanation on that build engineer side of things and concerns they have. Here is another universe that is like so core to the development process, the developer universe. What are they concerned about? Well, at least in my personal experience, and having spent so much time with application security engineers as well as developers closely, they're mostly concerned about deadlines. They have a lot of pressure to get the release cycle as fast as possible. Now we're even, living in the universe of agile development. So they're always concerned about velocity, like how fast can we push code to release? How can we resolve tickets? They, in fact, don't have much of a tolerance for false positives. False positives are like, false alarms. If you have too many of these, specifically from the developer universe, people would start to ignore that. So when it comes to developer tooling, very different from security. It's more about their own, IDE, their ticketing, whether it's Jira or whether it's ServiceNow. That's those are the verbiage, those are the things that we hear from them. And then how we need to utilize all this knowledge is really, really significant and important. And I hand this over to Abe to talk a little bit more about this universe as he has encountered in his own experience.
No, absolutely, and thank you, Kavya. And speaking with developers and being sensitive, if I, the security officer, the security engineer, wants to get things done, we really need to partner up with our friends in the DevOps and developer teams, and by doing that, understand how they're measured for success, right? And understanding that developers are measured by the velocity at which they're able to push new code releases, or the ability of closing out Jira or Bugzilla tickets, right? And therefore, they have zero tolerance for false positives, right? So in order to communicate to a developer, you need to communicate by means of a ticketing system. And the type of data that you communicate to them needs to be close to accurate as possible. So you have to employ tools that'll scan and provide you with minimal false positives as possible. And they also care about training, right? Now that the industry is starting to shift left, they want more visibility earlier on in the software development lifecycle, visibility from a security standpoint. Finding, bugs or vulnerabilities early on would mean a huge cost savings when it comes to remediation of those vulnerabilities. So one way to do that, besides employing like a DAS solution or an integration into the CI/CD tooling, is also promoting training events like community building or webinars like this, driving awareness early on prior to deploying or developing the web application, and also giving them a sense of guidance, right? So especially when secure coding best practices are new to developers, to that organization, they need access to support to a team of security advisors that can help them make sense and weed out false positives and make sense of what a vulnerability is. What is a SQL injection? What is OAuth? Even as high level as that, we want to be able to enable developers so that they're motivated in taking on the security approach.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And this is why we sort of try to use this catchy acronym CLI. So what is CLI? When you think of CLI, the first thing that comes to mind is something of a visual like this, command line interface. However, we're using this term to now define something else, to reinvent something else. CISO these days are concerned, and we went over all these universes. What's happening is the information security officers are trying to devise new ways to bring the dev teams and the security folks together. In the industry, we've even invented terms like DevSecOps or shift left, as Abe had suggested, to encourage security activities at the early stages of development. And that's why we're using this term CLI as a common language interface. We need a common language interface for developers and security. So we talked about how the devs, the release engineer, and the security folks, they're living in various universes. We need to not just bring them together, we need to bridge this whole thing by inventing these common languages. How can we do that? And we'll talk about this in detail a little bit more. But that's what Abe and I, are trying to communicate. We're trying to stick this CLI term because it's already there, but using it to communicate, we need a common language interface. Essentially define what the executives need to bridge the gap, bring both security and developers together. So let's explore this in this much needed common language interface for dev, sec, and ops. And I'm going to hand this over to Abe for the story that we talked about.
Yeah, going back to our earlier parts of the conversations, we're understanding what keeps a security officer up at night, and his team members or her team members. And that's compliance, that's risk, it's meeting those industry mandates that would enable them to play or to continue to serve in the markets that they provide services or products in, right? So we need to communicate that language all the way down to not just the build engineer, but to the developers. We want the developers to understand that security should be top of mind, but how can we enable the build engineers and the developers to enforce those policies as well as use the tools that are invested in by these companies and not invest six-figure tooling and then they just become a sunk cost. They're never used or never realize their overall value. And that kind of reminds me of the story that one of my professors, when I was going through a developer bootcamp had told to us, because now security at the time was becoming more and more of a topic, a subject matter that needs to be addressed. And when developing code in Python or in Java, they kind of threw in a few things in our senior project where security needed to be enforced, but we didn't really care about that, as students. And it just reminded me of a story he told regarding imagining a developer, right? He wanted to go visit his friend who was a security officer at his security offices, but unfortunately, he was stopped at the gate for not having his security badge proving or authenticating he is who he says he is. Now, funny enough and ironically, it was his friend that stopped him at the gate and told him to turn around and go back to where he came from. Now, on the flip side, consequently, the security officer needed patches to be done or applied to the application in runtime because they found some security flaws. So he sent a number of emails asking and providing the details that, hey, this is a SQL injection, this is a cross-site scripting, here are the details, the payload, please go out and fix it. Now, days go by and he has yet to hear back from his friend, the developer, and decides out of frustration, he goes to visit him face to face. Now, as he goes to the developer row or the offices where he was situated, he was stopped and he protested, why was I stopped? I'm one of the security officers. I've been sending a number of emails to my friend. So his friend comes out and he goes, hey, what's up? And he goes, why haven't you been, we've asked for these patches to be applied. What happened? He goes, I never received anything. He goes, oh, I sent you numerous emails. Oh, he goes, oh, guess what? Did you log in a Jira ticket? So there's a lot of truth in this conversation. And when developers need how they're measured, and this is why going back to understanding how a developer gets measured in KPIs, it's velocity and their ability to close out these Jira tickets. Now, if you give them a list siloed from that workflow, they're not going to prioritize that. And this comes up every time, almost 100% of the time, that developers would need some sort of plug-in to Jira or some sort of ticketing system in order for them to show that they are successful at what they do day to day, as well as being able to close out those vulnerability flaws. So we, as Wallarm, how we integrate into that overall cycle is providing security across the SDLC. So from a training standpoint, enablement, from requirements and design, and ongoing, because of course things change very rapidly in this industry. From production, if we start right, Wallarm enables protection and detection in the runtime environment. And this is actually what attracted me to wanting to work for Wallarm, is not only because I also come from White Hat, another application security vendor, but I like the fact that Wallarm applies blocking rules and protections real time, leveraging an AI and machine learning mechanism while integrating a DAS component to expose vulnerabilities and replaying attacks. So real time, we're reporting on the vulnerabilities, but we're also applying patches without having to manually apply or update those rule sets. Now, going into staging pre-deployment, this is where FAST comes in, and this is how we bridge the gap between security and DevOps. And we understand now that release engineers, they need automation and they need to somehow build in security into their existing workflow of testing out the web application. So what we're able to accomplish is having plugins for things like Jenkins, or leveraging a Docker container that has our Docker image to leverage these rule sets to apply payloads against the application in the pre-deployment stage to expose where those areas of exploitation are. So, administering payloads like a SQL injection, how does the application behave against that? And it's very easy, it's very seamless, and it doesn't take too much effort to onboard and to maintain. And then, of course, once those scans, whether in production or in staging, are complete, all that is communicated through a ticket, whether it's Jira or Bugzilla, because remember, going back to how to communicate between security, staging to development, we need a common language interface. And this is how we're able to accomplish that through these integration components at each stage of the SDLC.
Yeah, that's so well said, Abe. I totally agree with you. And now I want to sort of, double down on our thought process by using some of these survey results. This is a report that on 15th of July, GitLab released. It's about 2019 Global Development Report for DevSecOps. As some of you already know, GitLab is a web-based DevOps lifecycle tool that provides Git repository manager, providing wiki, issue tracking, and CI/CD pipeline features developed by GitLab Inc. So let's look at the main findings of the report in the security domain. And it's of course everything that Abe just talked about. First of all, a good DevOps security implementation is really critical to discover most of the security vulnerabilities at the early stages of the development. So according to the report, when the security teams are incorporated in the mature DevOps practice, the ability to effectively respond to this kind of vulnerability is 3 times stronger. And in fact, there are some numbers that even suggested, if we dug deeper in the report, is that they're 90% more likely to test between 91% or 100% of the code. That is a huge, huge achievement based on this survey. GitLab report also indicates that within the organizations that are struggling to implement DevOps, something that Abe earlier talked about, the organizations that are kind of just starting to understand these various universes. At that time, the report suggests the security professionals are more than 2.5, like 2.6 times more likely to encounter red tape, and that would slow down their effort to quickly fix the vulnerabilities. So needless to say that security is a critical issue for both companies and the users. Despite that, however, the security implementation in the industry is still evolving. I'd like to share some more numbers that, exactly from that survey, they indicate exactly that. Almost half of the security professionals surveyed, that is 49%, said that they struggle to get developers to make any remediation vulnerability a priority. And the reason is quite easy. With this development, production process, and market evolution, the full cycle of development is sort of shrunk. And sometimes security is always at the end of the process. So obviously these numbers sort of indicate that. And that's why we need this new sort of invention, the common language interface, the shift left and all that stuff. And for the same reason, only about 44% report that security vulnerabilities are a performance matrix for developers in their organizations. So how are they going to feel motivated? That's like, you know, almost like counterintuitive. Like if I'm not incentivized to fix these vulnerabilities, if the process doesn't exist that is already part of my workflow, then this is going to be very challenging. And this is such a timely survey. It demonstrates to us how important is DevSecOps, how important it's become, and how crucial it is for the various security, DevOps, developer universes that we speak a common language, use a common language interface. Now, let's look at where these results leave us. So if you are an executive or a developer, you're either encountering this sort of crossroad or you are already living in this sort of security, DevSecOps sort of universe. Or you're talking about it. And this is why we're having this discussion. This is what we need to learn from this discussion is we need to come together. We need to enable all these universes and talk a common language. Things that would enable them to either move fast, if that's what motivates them, close out tickets faster, provide metrics that work for them. And in fact, the big takeaway, and don't even take my word for it. I really love what Sid from the CEO of GitLab, Sid Bar, I'm gonna butcher his name, but what Sid says here is really wonderful. He literally used this survey and indicates that we need a single solution. And a single solution doesn't mean that it's like a silver bullet. It really just means solution. Solution includes, people, process, technology. But we need to simplify and just sort of provide that single enablement sort of interface that can provide visibility into both sides of the process for streamlined deployment. Love that quote. And it just really brings home that, you can't bombard all these universe with things they don't understand or things that are not really they're motivated by. So moving on then, what really it means, whether you're from this universe of development, whether you're a CISO, whether you're a build engineer, no matter what universe you belong to, among the security and development as an organizational entity, you're constantly looking to achieve higher performance. Basically, what you're really looking for is, this sort of people, process, technology, sort of unified solution that plugs right into your CI/CD pipeline. It will allow you to remain agile, to make risk-based decision if there is no friction between the devs and the security. Naturally, you need to adopt processes and tools that plug into, that make the security native. They make, sort of bake security into the development process. And then that would subsequently allow the development engineer, even the CISOs, to sort of enforce things that they define, enforce the development policies, enforce the release, policy that they need. And likewise, so I want to sort of bring it to a close at this point and lay out just, few key takeaways that we need to keep in mind. So whether you're a CISO or a build engineer or a developer, here's what you can do. You can achieve higher performance, you can reduce risk, and you can enable the business goals by these three very basic things. Number one, automation. Automation is going to be your friend. Automation is one of the keys to consistent and meaningful AppSec adoption in this sort of evolving world. By automating manual processes and building tools into a continuous integration and continuous delivery pipeline, development and operations teams have increased workflows efficiencies, and the trust increases between these groups, which is obviously very, very essential to sort of bring these various universes together. In fact, organizations are also realizing that there is a value in applying and sharing these, automation by incorporating security principles earlier in this SCLC. So this creates this, shorter feedback loop that Abe earlier indicated decreases friction, allows engineers to detect and fix security and compliance issues faster and more naturally as a part of this overall development, software development workflows. Number 2, false positives. We got to pay attention to false positives. Whether you're a CISO, making a decision, what kind of tools and what kind of processes you want to adopt. A false positive is like a false alarm. Your house alarm is triggered and there is no burglar. In web application security, a false positive is when an application security scanner indicates that there is a vulnerability, something like an SQL injection, but in reality there isn't. So by nature, we humans tend to start ignoring these false alarms rather quickly. Happens all the time at my home. The fire alarm goes off almost every other month, and nowadays I don't even care. I look outside. Is this something real or not? But if this happens in AppSec, which is a move fast universe, the people are going to start to ignore that. Pen testers are doing the same with web application pen tests. For example, if a web application security scanner detected 200 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and if the first 20 variants are false positives, well, the pen tester is going to assume that they're all false positives, and he's most likely going to ignore the rest. So by doing so, there are chances that the real web application vulnerabilities are going to be left undetected. And this is why, and I'm going to get a little pitchy, but this is important stuff, this is why I love Wallarm's Gen 3 detection model, because it's machine learning based. And, recently I'm reading this book by Peter Klemenko. It's called The Master Algorithm. It really is about the philosophy of machine learning. And what I learned from there is, you allow machine learning to sit in your environment by nature, inevitably it's going to learn from it, and it's going to over time get better. And that's why I'm so happy to be continuously learning with Wallarm and sort of learning about their solution, and that's what I recommend as well. And finally, number 3, as CISOs, as developers, as build engineers, anyone who has any stake in the game when it comes to application security, embrace the culture of DevSecOps. And with that, let's bring it to a close. Let's see if we have questions that we can take. Some of the questions are coming in. Mitch, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do. Yes, we do. The first one is kind of a more higher level question. What are strategies and key integration points for automating security into the dev tool chain?
It's a great question. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and back up to one of the slides so that we can also provide an illustration to it. And that's a very great question. So just keeping in mind that the software development lifecycle, it could have, integrating security could be left to right, but oftentimes, especially for an immature application security program, it goes right to left. Because you first want to establish a baseline of what your risk exposure is, how wide the attack surface is. So you're going to administer things like a pen test, right, to look at areas of exposure, or a DAS solution, a dynamic application security tool, to drive some sort of visibility and understanding how many points of exploits are there. But unfortunately, the nature of DAS scanners come littered with false positives, and that's something that we've also addressed here at Wallarm. In the runtime, we have our WAF, which is truly next generation, and I say that just because it has AI and ML where you can automatically generate the rules with low overhead. But also what makes it next generation is its ability to replay attacks and identify what type of vulnerability that sat behind that attack. So uncovering, on top of getting the blocking rules in place, but also uncovering what exploit what type of exploit it is, or a vulnerability like a patch reversal, for example, or cross-site scripting. Now that's one juncture point. So the next one would be pre-deployment or staging. And this is how, whether you have a build pipeline tool like a Circle CI or a Jenkins or a GitLab, you can leverage our we call it FAST, which is short for Framework for Application Security Testing, which is essentially our ability to leverage a fuzzer to drop payloads and for our ability to understand the endpoints and the behavior of the application. And by dropping payloads, we're fanning out thousands of security tests for looking for vulnerabilities listed in the OWASP top 10. So seeing how the application would behave to certain payloads would help us, and leveraging a fuzzer also minimize false positive rates. And without adding any additional friction, we do have plugins or Docker containers or images that are available. So if you want to if your release engineer would only adopt security and security testing within their environment, they would have to have some sort of plugin or integration point. So that's what we're also able to deliver, which also covers the common language interface, right? Security sets the policy, staging, or rather the build engineers, they enforce that policy by administering those tests. Now, the output of those tests would come in the form of a JIRA ticket. If we go back to this slide here, right here. So after the artifact is created, they're tested for unit integration, regression testing, and security tests, which could be SAS, SCA, or DAST. If it fails, it'll output a JIRA ticket or a Bugzilla ticket, which then would be communicated further left to your developers, who would apply those patches and then rinse and repeat this process. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it seems like a very comprehensive answer. Thank you very much. Next question from our audience is, who should be responsible for configuring and implementing security? Something like they referenced the FAST framework. Is that the DevOps engineer? Is that the configuration administrative sysadmin? Is it the development architect lead? Who all does this on a dev team in a DevOps setting?
And Abe, you deal with that all the time, right? This is like such a common question. Various organizations, they are different sizes, different shapes. So it really just depends, right? Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. For small businesses, sometimes the security officer is also the DevOps and developer. In more bigger enterprises, those are all siloed activities, which is why these critical points of integration is necessary, right? But in the case where it's a large enterprise and you have different juncture points as far as how the conversation changes and the workflow takes a turn, it could be here the security officer sets the policy, and then those policies are then fed into your testing enforcement. And then, of course, with that data that comes from the output of the test, the developers would apply those patches. So sometimes it does take the different silos to come together and to see how do we bake it into our workflows, whether it's a DevOps engineer or release engineer. They know their tooling best, right? It really depends ultimately who's in charge or owns those projects from a security standpoint, and then translating that into a DevOps standpoint.
And then another thing that I love is, even though these tools can be, adopted by the teams, one must always ensure that you have continuous support. So during the configuration time, or even sometimes tuning these things might take a little bit of time, actually much less than what traditional scanners and other things take. But yeah, still look for solutions that provide you that support. And then based on the organizational size, like Abe said, it would differ from different organizational requirements.
Absolutely. And sometimes there are security teams or DevOps teams that would have cold feet and have moving forward in conversations. That's why there's always the option for POCs, or even if they don't have time for a POC, desperately need something in place, we do have support options where we will step you through understanding what a vulnerability is, how do we deploy this in your environment, and then how do we enforce our own best practices and augment your current best practices to make your application security program mature as fast as possible and get the data that you need as accurate as possible. So it's a different way.
Wonderful. Anything else to add before I get to the next question? We good?
I think, yeah, let's take the next question.
Okay, excellent. I love this question. Developers hate anything that slows us down or gets in the way. I think you mentioned friction, Abraham. How can you minimize security's impacts to the developer's workflow, but still meet the requirements of the organization, the CISO, the security group, et cetera?
Absolutely, and it's all about going back to that common language interface, right? The entire organization has a singular goal, and that's to meet the demands of, well, at least in the case of SDLC, there are third-party demands, maybe enforced by a compliance mandate or a customer that really needs to prove their due diligence that they're doing whatever it takes to protect PII on behalf of whoever consumes their services. So it takes security and DevOps to come together. And the only way for developers to avoid that friction, or us to add no additional or even minimal friction to their process, is making sure that we are able to operate security within their familiar environment. So tooling, right? So, you mentioned IDEs, or are there sort of plugins for vulnerabilities to be visible? And how do we address those vulnerabilities and making sure there's a visible audit that these developers are taking on these vulnerabilities, right? And the only way to hold a developer accountable is not through an email, but really through a ticketing system. So it's visible to everyone. The work's being done, and it's being done in the way that is prioritized within an environment that's familiar to them. And of course, training too, right? Enablement is done that way.
Excellent. Kavya, next question's for you. I'm guessing it's probably because of your technical and CISO background. Kavya, what's the number one, in your estimation, misunderstanding security engineers have about DevOps and app developers? What's the number one thing you think security engineers should know about DevOps and app developers they don't know?
Oh, so repeat that question for me, Mitch. What is the number one misunderstanding?
Yeah, misunderstanding that security engineers have about DevOps or about app developers.
Right. And oh my gosh, this is such a timely question, Abe, right? And I can really answer that from a very recent experience. This happened just last month at KubeCon. We met so many security, interested developers. Like, we mostly assume, security folks assume, that developers don't care about security, which is so false. It is so false. After meeting almost about over like 1,000, 2,000 developers during KubeCon in San Diego, it was confirmed to me. I mean, all these developers were coming up, and these are like people who are adopting absolutely new processes like Kubernetes, Dockers, cloud native environments, because we had just launched, sort of a Istio native, Kubernetes native new product. And all of these developers, they really just wanted to truly understand how can they bake in security within these new things that they're spinning up. It was so wonderful to hear. So even though as a CISO, even I had this sort of misconception at times, like, oh, the devs don't care. No. I think the developers truly want to be wonderful. And another person that I met at Amsterdam, her name is Katie Anand on Twitter. I'm forgetting what her real name is, probably Katie Anand. So Katie told me that when she talks to developers, she really just wants to help them. And because she learned that all of the developers really truly care about security, they just need to know the right language. They need to know the right tools, and that's what they're looking for. And that's why Abe and I sort of spun up this idea right after KubeCon about CLI, is if we can find this sort of common language with respect to people, processes, and technology, and that's exactly what Wallarm's goal is to create this nice ecosystem, then we can sort of eliminate that misunderstanding. And it's almost happening, you know, those shift left, the DevSecOps, these things, and now we're talking about the CLI. We're just using this cheeky term to sort of interpret, you know, enumerate that this is what is necessary. So yeah, the biggest misunderstanding is developers don't care about security, which is absolutely untrue. It's a false idea. They do care about it, and they really want to learn. We just need to enable them.
Great. I would definitely agree with you there. Developers do care.
Oh, yeah.
Next question is kind of jumping down a path about specific technologies. Do you work with Envoy for cloud native, service mesh security, traceability, visibility into applications? This would be part of your KubeCon CNCF community in San Diego that just happened just last week. So great question for that. Maybe somebody was there.
Yeah, very timely question. We do actually. In fact, just last month, we launched a new sort of a Envoy native service mesh protection, which not just protect like east-west, but also north-south. So yeah, you need to sort of contact Wallarm if that's something that you're looking into. And not only that, Wallarm is continuously looking into protecting cloud-native environments. So we do have Envoy, native protection now. We are also looking into other aspects that are, being built with respect to Kubernetes and Docker ecosystem. So for sure, we do.
Great. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in Envoy these days as we deploy more complex service meshes. That's for sure.
That's right.
Great. Last question that we have here, unless anything else comes in, is are there any specific recommendations for reducing false positive? I know that's kind of something that everybody struggles with, and back to the friction question. Are there any recommendations or suggestions you have about reducing false positives?
Well, one thing you can do is if you're going to be in Santa Monica on 24th of January, then come to my talk. I'm talking about exactly that. And what I'm talking about is using machine learning for application security, because there is a lot of snake oil in the industry. I'm going to remove that sort of, it's like a myth busting talk. And that's the term, because, sometimes when I use this term and people, not all of them, not the entire crowd, but sometimes people roll their eyes because this is machine learning, artificial intelligence has become this buzzword that people try to sell stuff with. And that's why I'm going to do this talk. And that's the answer to the question. If you want to reduce false positives, you do have to adopt machine learning. You do have to allow algorithm to learn about your environment and sort of not just do Gen 1 detection, which mod security does, not just do, and mod security is one of the firewalls, web application firewalls, not just do like a Gen 2 detection, which we were talking about Nginx and, F5. Do Gen 3 detection, which is ML based. Just deploy something that is sitting in an environment, is very, incorporating whatever your dev practices are, understanding what kind of threat modeling is, like what kind of attack surface are you facing. These are the challenges that, because every organization is evolving, your tools need to evolve over time. And it can't be so that somebody has to tune it. It can't be regex based. Something that I really love about Wallarm, it's not regex based. It's not one of those. It's really, truly ML based and Gen 3. And that's what I recommend that we need to reduce false positives and just bake things within that CI/CD, adopt these ML and AI based models.
Great. Is that the AppSec California conference that you're speaking at?
That's right. Yeah.
Great. Well, good luck with your talk there. Maybe we'll get even some more people coming. Well, good. I think that wraps up our questions. Well, fantastic job to both of you, both on the presentation and on the Q&A. I mean, just a wealth of information that you all shared. So thanks, Kavya. Thanks, Abraham.
Thank you, Mitch, for having us.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for your questions too. Also, let's kind of jump into finding out who our Amazon gift card winners are. I'd like to announce the three winners are Patrick S., Todd A., and Christian L. the folks here at DevOps.com will be in contact with you about getting those cards. Maybe help with some Christmas shopping, holiday shopping here. Well, this has been a great webinar talking about security and DevOps and DevOpsSec. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Kavya Pearlman, who is the cybersecurity strategist with Wallarm, and Abraham Milan, who's security solutions architect with Wallarm as well. We'd of course like to thank you, our participants, our listeners, for joining us today and being part of our webinar. We know that your time is super valuable. The fact that you spent close to an hour with us, we appreciate very much. It's been my pleasure hosting today's webinar. Hope everyone has a great day and be careful out there.
Thank you, Mitch. Bye, everyone.